What's that? An Edgar Allan Poe short story about someone committing a murder and getting away with it before ultimately telling on themselves, or some other calamity of guilt overtaking the speaker? It can't be, but it is. Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here pardon me, for another short story discussion. Today's short story comes to us from Edgar Allan Poe. This is a video which will appear in 3 separate playlists here on the channel. Number 1 being the short story discussion playlist. Number 2 being the Edgar Allan Poe playlist, a playlist of videos dedicated completely to Edgar Allan Poe. And number 3 is the Horror Fest 2024 playlist here on the channel. The short story in question today is known as The Imp of the Perverse, which was not just my nickname in high school. So this video will have 3 sections: a So What Happened recap of the short story, a literary criticism section where we talk about the goings-on in the short story, and finally a writer's corner where we talk about some of the writing stuff that can be taken from this short story for us as writers. So, what happened? Nothing. Nothing happens in the short story, but our speaker spends 3 pages trying to convince us that there is an imp of the perverse, quote unquote, which more or less possesses people and makes them do heinous things. After all, it isn't natural, the argument goes, to act in a self-harmful way, like committing murder to a person, just a totally random example, committing murder, even if that murder would hypothetically lead to the hypothetical murderer inheriting, hypothetically, from the murderee, his entire estate. Quote, inherit his entire estate. Now, so flash forward anyway, our speaker has murdered a guy in order to inherit his entire estate. And it was so brilliant that the coroner said it was an act of God. It was by an act of God that the man had died. The only thing is, our speaker keeps talking to himself, keeps telling himself, I am safe. I am safe. Before one day blurting out, if I be not fool enough to make an open confession. And in the wake of saying this thing in public, he becomes so utterly paranoid that he starts running away as if he were guilty. And so a crowd forms to chase after him as if he were guilty of what no one knows, but they do catch him. And then he admits to absolutely everything. That is what happens in this short story, about as Edgar Allan Poe as ever it could be. So, what are the things to talk about in this short story? I think that we have one of the more interesting things to talk about here. We get this in the... Hold on. Yeah, we get this in the narrative here. The idea of detection never once entered my brain. Oh no, I'm closing everything. The idea of detection never once entered my brain. Of the remains of the fatal taper I had myself carefully disposed. I had left no shadow of a clue by which it would be possible to convict or even to suspect me of the crime. It is inconceivable how rich a sentiment of satisfaction arose in my bosom as I reflected upon my absolute security. For a very long period I was accustomed to revel in this sentiment. It afforded me real delight than all the mere worldly advantages accruing from my sin. But there arrived at length an epoch from which the pleasurable feeling grew, by scarcely perceptible gradations, into a haunting and harassing thought. It harassed because it haunted. I could scarcely get rid of it for an instant. It is quite a common thing to be thus annoyed with the ringing in our ears, or rather in our memories, of the burthen of some ordinary song, or the song in itself be good, or the opera meritorious. In this manner, at last, I would perpetually catch myself pondering upon my security, and repeating in a low undertone the phrase, "I am safe." One day, whilst sauntering along the streets, I arrested myself in the act of murmuring, half aloud, these customary syllables. In a fit of petulance, I remodeled them thus: "I am safe, I am safe, yes, if I be not fool enough to make an open confession." Basically, that's the entire short story there. But the interesting thing to talk about with that is, why would you be so sure that you felt safe if you kept telling yourself you felt safe? If the fear of detection had never actually occurred to our speaker, why the need to self-soothe? It seems that our speaker was living in constant denial of his own guilty consciousness. Personally, I know this because I do this. I haven't murdered anyone. I am safe. But I do this with my stove whenever I cook something and leave the house. I turned the stove off. Yes, I turned the stove off. I am safe, if I be not fool enough to leave the stove on. So I know that that is what that is his mind wearing him down, these little self-soothing things that we do in order to calm ourselves while there is something else large bothering us. And then there is a weird little phrase that our speaker says here, the third paragraph from the end. They say, this is after he's been caught, they say that I spoke with a distinct enunciation, but with marked emphasis and passionate hurry, as if in dread of interruption before concluding the brief but pregnant sentences that consigned me to the hangman and to hell. There's something that should stand out there. This confession, he says, consigned him to the hangman and to hell. To the hangman, perhaps, but to hell? Didn't the crime itself condemn our speaker to hell, unless our speaker is conflating getting away with it with being innocent? After all, the idea of hell is the idea of an afterlife, a punishment in the ever after, in the hereafter. It is an idea of cosmic justice, not earthly justice. Some argue that that's the entire reason behind the compulsion towards having a hell devised into religion. Some people say that's the whole reason it's even there. There are stories from the early church of people who are higher ups in the church. This is a story from Christopher Hitchens, who were defending the idea of hell by saying, well, look, heaven's great, but on the days where heaven isn't as great as it could be, I can step over the edge and watch all the people suffering in hell. Wouldn't that be even greater? So there's the idea that the place of hell was a construction of a second draft religion in order that bad things not go unpunished, which is interesting from the First Testament, with all of the bad things that happen from the good guys, right? Bathsheba, for instance. Now, should our speaker actually be conflating the idea of getting away with it with the idea of being innocent? I think that there is real substance there to suggest that our speaker is not just with guilty conscience, that our speaker is not just a bad guy who had murdered someone in order that he inherit their entire estate. But I think that if there is some idea that our speaker believes getting away with it means you're innocent, that our speaker really is deluded, that there is some type of actual mental calamity happening with our speaker. Now, that raises the final question here. How much do we believe our speaker? Is our speaker lying to us? So I think that we do not believe our speaker. I think that the believability of the narrator is in question here. So I think that there is some place in the short story where anyone reading it sort of realizes, okay, something's not right. I don't believe the person telling me this story. But where does that disbelief begin? Does the disbelief begin with the whole reason the individual is in prison? After all, we must be in prison too if we're hearing this story, or we are a prison guard, etc. Do we not believe his entire story? Do we not believe the part about inheriting things, because that would be something fanciful about which to lie? Do we not believe the speaker when he says that, well, I kept saying this thing to myself and that's the reason I took off? Do we not believe this individual starting with the idea that they were not particularly all that they could not be held responsible for this action because they are deluded? So I think that even the idea that this is an unreliable narrator comes with a whole new set of questions and problems. Where do we stop believing this narrator? Now, there are a couple things to take from this short story as a writer as well. And the first thing that I want to talk about is the objective correlative. Not in ideas, but things. The first 3 pages of this short story are completely wrapped up in our speaker telling us all of these little theories he has. And, what I don't understand is you don't act against your own self-interest. So why do people do it? It's not a natural thing. The first portion of this short story reads almost as if it were an ethics paper. Now, you could say philosophy, you could say religion, you could say any of these fields of studies, but from the classes that I had taken, ethics was the most explicitly boring. So that's what I'm going to go with here. The first 3 pages of this short story feel like an ethics essay. Is that necessary? What if, instead of that opening spiel, what we have is a short story that gets straight into the action, and during the action, our speaker actually instills upon us all of these theories that he has. During the action, we have a building of the character for all of these theories that he runs through his own head. Maybe what we get then even would be something a little bit deeper. Maybe we get this idea of incantation, right? The speaker is incanting to himself, I am safe, I am safe. What if before the act of murder there is something else that he is incanting to himself that would build the character of the speaker? It would build the idea of that incantation in the reader. Prior to the murder, he incants to himself, I am not a bad person. I'm not a bad person. I'm not a bad person. Commits the murder, and all of a sudden he's incanting to himself, I am safe. I am safe. This becomes a much different short story, and we don't have to have all of the preamble here. And then the last thing to talk about here, something that I can appreciate. There lives in no man at some period, or There lives in no man who at some period has not been tormented, for example, by an earnest desire to tantalize a listener by circumlocution. The speaker is always aware that he displeases. He has every intention to please. He is usually curt, precise, and clear. The most laconic and luminous language is struggling for utterance upon his tongue. Irony, the use and deployment of irony. What a wonderful thing. That's all I have for this short story discussion. If you like or appreciate what it is that I do here, hitting a like button really does help me out, as it tells YouTube to share this video with other literature lovers. And if you find yourself here by chance but not design, literature is the only thing I talk about on this channel, dropping multiple videos every single week, and I hope to have you back for the next one.